remember Courtaulds factory coming to Carrickfergus and all the workmen and machinery and everything else. And it was a great thing for Carrickfergus at the time because it brought a lot of workforce to the town, you know. And I was a wee boy, I was climbing trees, but when it came at the start, I remember, you know, building, you know, big bulldozers, levelling the land, and I watched the buildings going up.
Yes, right from the 1950s onwards, Courtaulds and certainly had the benefit of making Carrickfergus expand and develop. There was new housing built, so there was an awful lot of additional people came to live in Carrick to be close to the job opportunities that the likes of Courtaulds, ICI, Careers, just to name a few, brought to the town.
There was very little in the way of employment around Carrickfergus. There was Amblers and there was Taylor's Mill and a few other small factories. But generally there wouldn't have been a great deal of employment around Carrick. And then with Courtaulds, ICI, Carreras, all of a sudden Carrick was a catchment area for those who throughout Northern Ireland wanted to work in a large factory environment. So a lot of people arrived from sort of like as far north as Strabane, Londonderry, and as far south as Newry. But those people didn't necessarily want to live in Carrick. It was the job opportunity that brought them to Carrick.
Those early days, they would have been the major employer in Carrick, and with any major employer, there's going to be a lot of secondary employers sort of feeding their skills or their into the system. So, yeah, and then of course ICI came along and Carreras came along. So you had three major employers, each employing over 1,000 people. So it made Carrick, very buoyant economically, and the town grew both in terms of what it would offer town centre. And housing, of course. So, yeah, it did. It was a big player for what Carrick, grew to be.
I do remember that because Dad was chief electrical engineer, there were big red letters spelling out the word Courtaulds. There were massive letters just on the front of the rectangular admin building. And Dad always said, if one of the lights went out and one of the letters, then all of the lights had to go out. In other words, if Courtaulds, if the S was missing, then no, it had to be fixed. No lights were permitted. And it happened quite a lot, actually. There was no light in Courtaulds. Well, to my eye, it seemed to be quite a lot. Yeah, but I suppose just bulbs went out and that was that. But it was always fixed again soon.
SAT, interesting aptitude tests to get in. I remember they were well-attended days. There was a good 20 young fellas on my day, and I'm sure there were so many other days. So we were doing things like a lock was parts of a door lock were left on the table, and you had to assemble that, and the same with the bicycle bell, as well as English and maths and kind of tests. So I was offered an apprenticeship in painting and decorating. Not what I wanted to do. I wanted to be an electrician. It was cleaner and tidier. I didn't really want to be a plumber because that's what Dad was. So my third choice was painting and decorating, and I was offered that and took that. So it was in that maintenance end I first started.
My brother, I'd applied, my brother was in it, I said, and my father was in it, but my father at this stage had died, and my brother said, there's a form. He says, they're looking for a metal worker. I says, I've already filled one in. He says, Sturdy, who was the boss, he was our foreman. He says, sure, he says, fill that form in and get it in. So from then, I think more or less the job was mine without an interview, but I still had to go through the process of an interview.
When I was 16, I guess, I went to Sumlock Contometer College in Belfast. Come out of there, my first job was with William Ewart and Sons, who do the Irish linen. And then the opportunity came up in Carrick, so it saved me bus ride into Belfast every day, which was always. So I worked with the accountants. It was a lot of it was more manual, obviously. Then it wasn't all computerized or anything. There was a room we were treated very much like children. We were lined up in rows facing the front, and there was a manager who sat facing us with a big desk across the front, just like a school teacher would. At the back of our office, which was the main office, there was a room with sort of like a typing pool, but also had contometer operators in there as well. It was the same setup, rows of desks and a woman manager sitting at the front.
I believe it's just over 2,000 it employed. The rumour was always 3,000. I don't know how that happened. And that was probably in its heyday. 7 departments. The names would roll off the tongue for me. Fibro, polyester, Tenasco, Cellon, that's where I worked. And it would have employed approximately 350 to 400 people in our department. Maybe upward on 500 in better times.
So the chemical plant was the top, and there was a lab, and then the big building, it's still there, you can see the big tall building. It would have had various stages of spinning. So the viscose was a big term, came in and eventually turned into thread and put onto these bobbins. And then the painters were part of that process, depending on the denier. I'm remembering these words I've never used for years. Depending on the denier, the bobbin had to be, the top and bottom had to be a certain colour. So depending on what denier was being focused on at that time, we would then have had a big surge on respraying the top and bottom of the bobbin with the purple, the yellow, whatever.
Now, Courtaulds had, as I say, utilities like water, gas and electricity and steam. And they were then shared round there were about 6 factories on the site. The 3 major ones were the viscose, being Fibro, which was one of them. It made large bales of what looked like cotton wool. Then there was the tire cord factory, which was Tenasco. And there was then the CMA, and that was they produced the chemicals necessary for the chemical bath for the viscose production. Viscose, I don't know whether you know or not, it's made from wood. It's you break that down and then you in a chemical bath, and then that allows you to spin yarn from it.
Basically, it was like bringing in the little polymer chips, and they would have been melted and processed and turned into what you could really only describe as being like a big piece of cotton wool that would have been about sort of 12 feet across and maybe 6 inches deep. And then that was put into bales. That's the bones of it. And the bales would have been quite heavy. I mean, one man wouldn't have lifted one. They would have been about sort of 1.5 meters long, about sort of 1 meter high, and maybe about 1.5 meters wide. So they were quite substantial.
So every yarn had a different colour, a different batch, a different code, and you had to sort all those out, put them on a pallet. I'm trying to think how many it was. It was probably about 18 boxes on a pallet, and heavy boxes, and then they were tied up twice, put on the weighbridge, and then they were brought down to the bottom warehouse where it was stored.
where the Fergus Inn, or the hotel is now, that used to be the Courtaulds shop. So we had a factory shop there, and people used to buy stuff out of it all the time. Funnily enough, my mother bought some fabric to have somebody make a duvet cover for my bed, and it was lovely looking stuff, but it had been like fire guarded or whatever you call it. There was a name for the product of the and you put it was in the material, but it meant that none of the heat from the feather duvet could get out to me, so I was freezing in bed with this thing. But yes, people used to buy stuff. Sort of, you could have bought shirts, you could have bought women's blouses, that sort of thing.
Courtaulds had a vast, in their shop, that a vast array of stuff you could have bought. It was obviously all Courtaulds make. Maybe it was Courtauld or something like that was on it. Was the make was on the label, but you had that. But they didn't. We didn't do it in Carrickfergus. That was over in England. It was done, and then it was brought over to the shop. Just nice jackets, lovely jackets you could have worn. I bought, I think, 2 of them. Beautiful jacket to wear, because those days you did wear jackets, but now you wear something casual.
My father was the foreman mechanical engineer in Central Services. My mother worked in it for a heck of a long time too, as did my sister. But I also had an uncle, a couple of uncles, and some cousins. So it was a bit of a family affair. But it was like that for a lot of people. A lot of people actually, a lot of families were employed by them.
The first person was my father. And my father was James Edwards, or Jim Edwards, AJ, Alfred James. And Dad actually was English. He was born in Tewkesbury and brought up in Tewkesbury. And then he was stationed here during the war. When he came out of the forces, then I think his first ever job in Northern Ireland might have been with a local plumber, a man called Mackay, a local plumber. And then he went to Courtaulds, and he worked a long, long time in Courtaulds. But also, I'm not quite sure when this all started, probably when I was old enough to be looked after by someone else, in other words, not a baby. Mum started working in Courtaulds in the spinning department and worked shift work. And I always remember the 6 to 2 and 2 to 10. The ladies never did night work, but they always had 6 to 2 or 2 to 10. And our daily schedule was scheduled or routined by the fact what shift was Mum on. And then, obviously, when you worked shifts, there was 2 or 3 days of a gap before you changed shift, which meant that was time at home with us, which was great. So Mum and my father, and then in much later years, my older brother, Billy Edwards, he then became an apprentice in Courtaulds and served his time at painting and decorating.
Initially, prior to Courtaulds, he had worked for, I think it was called the Electricity Board in Belfast, and he commissioned Ballylumford Power Station. He was an electrical engineer. At some point prior to 1949, he was appointed as Chief Electrical Engineer in Courtaulds. That was before Courtaulds was up and running. The buildings in Courtaulds had started in 1946. So there's a newspaper article about him being employed prior, and the newspaper is dated the 8th of April 1949. And he's mentioned as one of the first employees of Courtaulds in Carrick. He was busy. I always remember him. He didn't wear a suit. He wore, I suppose, flannels and some sort of a jacket, like a sports jacket, and a tie, often a maroon tie. His ties weren't plain; they had something on them, and it may have been a Courtaulds symbol, but not all the time did he wear one of those ties. And I think tie pins were in those days, which would have helped him as an electrical engineer because there's a lot of machinery about. So a tie pin would have held the tie in place so it didn't get caught up in machinery. And sometimes the tie was, I remember, was tucked in between the 2 buttons so that it didn't get caught. machinery.
And one of the duties of the office boy was to deliver post and collect post around the entire 100-acre site. Now, that meant twice a day I had to walk practically through every square inch or square foot of that site, the different offices, and deliver mail, collect mail, and then return and sort out mail that had to be posted out. Now, what that did do, it gave me a great insight into Courtaulds, Carrickfergus, and how man-made fibres were produced. Maybe not in detail in some of the processes, but I got a great overall picture of that site.
Mum's working conditions would have been steady. I was nearly going to say long, but it would have been long. It was 2 to 10 and 6 to 2, but noisy. I always remember them saying it was noisy. And I remember Mum saying that they couldn't converse because of the noise. They had some sort of hand signalling thing, but they couldn't converse. But they could say, "I'm leaving the room for a certain reason," that sort of thing.
Courtaulds were very good at recognising people with ability. That even, that happened even down in the administration block in my first 10 years with Courtaulds. They certainly looked to see what you were capable of, and say you were just automatically offered promotion. So you were to different, higher grade jobs, and it was the same out in the production line. I really enjoyed out on the production lines from a mechanical and practical point of view. It was something I always excelled at, so it was. And that I found that I was able to do all that technical work and read their drawings and read their specifications, set the machines up exactly the way they were supposed to do. And when they realised that you had those abilities, they naturally just promoted you. So they did.
But I remember my mum used to say, "I'll not be doing any washing today because you can smell Courtaulds and it's going to rain." And usually did. But certainly there was acid in the factory, and it was sulfuric acid, so it was very, very dangerous product, and that was used throughout the factory, even where we were, not in the shop, but on the processing end, it was used, So, but to say environmentally, you didn't think in those days about it. It was just glad to get your day in.
Like the amount of pollution that Courtaulds caused. You see, nobody cared about pollution in those days. It was basically, jobs that that was in the forefront of everybody's mind. Like we had a pipe, an effluent pipe, and I assume it's still there because it was a massive structure. Went at least 250 feet out into the sea outside Courtaulds, and you would have been coming out of the plant, and the sea would have been red or green or blue, sort of stretching out maybe a quarter of a mile. As well as that, you had signs down Carrick Harbour warning you not to take any of the fish or the crayfish and eat them because they were polluted.
They had a waste pipe went out to the sea to discharge the effluent, which is very chemical, and went out for about a quarter of a mile. And during the build of that, it was just a wee road. The seawall was here, and they had to blast. There's a line of rocks went out into the sea, and they built it on top of that. But then they used to have to blast, and then they would stop the traffic briefly. But we young boys, we would go up and duck behind the wall when the explosion off the rocks would fly over the top. And that's one of the things I remember well, And the pipe was quite substantial. It was about 3 foot in diameter, and there's enough room to put 2 more on, and the concrete supports, but only ever used one. And we used to run out on the top of these when the tide was in, because it rarely was covered because so high up. And I remember fell off at one time. During the Troubles, 1972, I had the shop in Market on West Street, and North Street and West Street was bombed, right? That was 1972, and the same month, they actually blew up part of Courtaulds, you know, the big factory.
Yes, sadly, the Troubles did have a big impact on Courtaulds, and in the 70s, I think it was maybe 74, there was bombs went off in the polymer plant, which was the other half of the plant that I worked in, and there was 1 person killed, and there was 10 injured. So it was so. Politics in general never really showed much on the shifts, or if they showed, I was never aware of them. You know, everybody got on very, very well together. Courtaulds catered very well for the social life of the staff and the employees. They had marvellous football pitches, hockey pitches, great facilities for playing table tennis, even quoits. Some people maybe not even remember quoits, but quoits, badminton. We had Sammy Blair was an international at that time, and Sammy actually worked down in the administration with myself, and Sammy was a Carrick in his own right, so he was, but an international badminton player, and had great recognition for that.
The Courtaulds football team, it played in the amateur league, not at a very high level, but it was. I went on to play football at a reasonable level, but I was never as well treated as I was for Courtaulds. Most teams I played for, you took it in turns to take the kit home, and your mum washed them, and you brought them back the next week. Whereas in Courtaulds, no, you were given your kit and you returned your kit, and it was there for you the next day. Black and white stripes, if I remember.
During that time, we played inter-department football, which we won the competition against Polyester, against all the odds, because they were a far better team than we were. Tried to play hockey, which was inter-factory hockey in Ankleon. Hadn't a clue how to play hockey, but I enjoyed it. And we played cricket, which was inter-factory, and enjoyed that as well. My biggest love was snooker, and my friend who had lived very close to where I lived initially said to me, they're starting a snooker club up, do you want to join it? And I think it was 25p to join it. And I joined it in 1976. And say they're there now, we're still there today, albeit in a different name. I
played competitive badminton. I played sort of, higher level than what they were doing at Courtaulds. It was just a fun thing. So if they would have like little competitions, invited guest club in and tea and buns and all that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So if they were doing anything like that, I would go and play for them to make up a team. And I was walking out with a friend of mine, and she said, "Oh, there's a fella back from Carrick, or back from Canada. It would just suit you." And I said, "Oh, okay, good." And I walked in, met him, and we went out twice, and then we saw each other every night. And 6 months later, we were engaged, and 9 months later, we were married.
Actually, members of Courtaulds formed a show band in the 70s. Show bands were a great thing right throughout Northern Ireland at that time. And I played the trombone with the group, so I did. And we had some great times practicing in the canteen and, going out around different venues and playing at dances. and it had the benefit of, once the girls seen anybody up on stage and had this bright red suit on, they fell in love with the suit. I don't know about the people behind the suits, but we had a great time, and many, many great stories with that.
My bridesmaid was from Courtaulds, worked in the room at the back, the office behind us. Socially, it was a great bunch of people. It really was. Typically Irish, you get together for drinks and parties and socialising. And we used to organise barbecues out towards Browns Bay and out along those ways. There were big sort of openings, and we'd all probably take carloads of booze with us and go out there and have social times. But the dances and things that they had some beautiful, every Christmas there was a formal dance with long gowns and bow ties and the whole bit. And they were really, really looked forward to. And they were usually in Larne, in one of the big hotels there, because there wasn't really any in Carrick at the time. And they were very popular and well attended, and everybody really looked forward to them, and lots of talk about who was wearing what dresses. And, I really enjoyed that part of it. I enjoyed that part of Ireland as well, as more formal dances and things to go to. There's not really much of that anywhere anymore, I don't think.
I think the kinship or friendship of the female workers was actually probably more prolific and more widespread. Yeah, big time. And as I say, Mum's friends and the children of those friends are still people we know and exchange telephone calls with and Christmas cards and things.
A lot of people will always say about the Christmas parties that they had for the children, the pantomimes, and there was no expense spared by the company in doing that.
I think the social club organised the annual Christmas party, and that I do remember and looked forward to from year to year to year. And I've been only able to find one photograph of that, and that's me receiving my Christmas present from Santa. And whoever took the photo has just taken me. Sadly, we don't even see Santa. Although I have a vague memory of there being a photograph of me sitting on Santa's knee. So I think the social club organised the Christmas party, and my memory of that was ginormous. Probably if I was to see the room now, it would not be as big as my memory has it. But I remember what was the canteen that had a stage, and there was a show went on, and we were entertained. Oh, and I do remember a ventriloquist. Oh, it just had a sudden, real memory. And I can't remember his stage name, but I remember his real name was McCulloch. And he was brilliant, absolutely. And we just didn't know how it worked at all. So he would have been on, and various other bits and pieces of acts. And then the very end of it all was we were all called forward one by one to receive our present. And that was just mind-blowing.
The times I do remember is every Christmas. We couldn't wait for the Christmas parties. They were fantastic. I think they had like a younger children in one Saturday, and then the following Saturday they had the slightly older ones. It was always a Saturday. And the parties were held in what appeared to me to be a huge canteen. I still see the layout of the room. Stage at the top of the room, and to the left of the stage were double doors where Santa's sleigh came through, and we really believed that was Santa, and all dressed up with a big beard, and he gave out the presents. But Santa only came in after the main show of the day, where rows and rows and rows of children sat watching the stage, and there were magicians and singing. We always sang "She'll be coming round the mountain when she comes," and other campfire type songs.
Courtaulds did an annual pantomime. It was huge. Like, it was a really big deal. Basically, all the kids of all the workers were invited to come to it. I can remember, I think I was in a couple of them, but I remember the one I was in was the Yellow Submarine. It was based on the Beatles, obviously, at the time. There was a man called Davy McCulloch. He actually was my sister's father-in-law. He was the MC and he was the host, and he told jokes and did a bit of magic and was just amazing with all the kids, got them all riled up and shouting and cheering, and you know, it was a really good job. And then we put on skits and singing, and not that I was any good at the singing, but we did it anyway.
At that time, all of the major industries, ICI, had laid off the biggest majority of their workforce as well. So it was a sort of a time of depression. So it was. It was more or less unavoidable, simply because the production costs for producing yarn in the United Kingdom was much higher. Wages were much higher. Everything pointed to the likes of Courtaulds and ICI and many companies of going to Asian sites to and transferring their production lines to Asian sites just for that incentive of being able to get their fabrics produced a lot cheaper.
By the time we get to 1981, I would have started mid-70s. By the time you get to 1981, May, we were the last people to leave the premises. And it was eerie because if you look at the front of Courtaulds, you see the basic red brick. That was admin and the main canteens. Our salon was about half a mile up a long corridor, 2 corridors, right at the very back of the factory. So you can imagine what it was like in the later stages, walking up this ghost town to get to your place of work. Really, really strange.
Really did. I loved the place. You know, I never liked the job. I wanted to get into Courtaulds before I did get in, because my brother worked in it, my father worked in it, and that seemed to be what Courtaulds was. Courtaulds was a factory family. The next door neighbour to me, he worked in it, and his 2 daughters worked in it. My uncle, who was up the top of the street, worked in it. So it was a family, I'd say a family factory. But really, when I heard I had to go that day, I didn't know where to turn.
I would really like to put on record that it was a privilege to work for Courtaulds. They were an excellent company to work for. They looked after their employees and staff very, very well. And, I had a good quality life. I was able to stay in my own hometown, get married and rear a family. And that was all, a good part of that was all based on the security that Courtaulds provided. So I'd just like to thank them.